Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, before I begin, tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. I didn't expect that a knock at my door would rearrange the furniture of my heart, but that's what happened on a dusky Thursday when the sky over our street turned the color of old copper. I had just set a pot of chicken soup to simmer, the kind my mother taught me to make when the house needed calming down. The windows were open, letting in a breeze that smelled faintly of rain and cut grass. I was alone, half listening to a radio host talk about ball games and garden tips, when the doorbell rang with a polite urgency that felt out of time with our slow evening. When I opened the door, there stood Daniel, my son Mark's friend from high school, now in his mid-20s, lean and long-shouldered, with that same respectful posture he had as a teenager when he'd call me ma'am, even after I told him to stop. He was holding a small paper bag and wearing an expression I couldn't place, something between apology and determination. "Hi, Mrs. Bennett," he said. "I hope it's okay I came by." I told him he could always come by. That used to be true when the boys were inseparable, their laughter rolling up the stairs like marbles. Time has a way of thinning laughter into memories, and we hadn't seen much of Daniel since Mark moved 2 states away for work. Still, I stepped aside and said what mothers always say to boys they once watched grow up. "Come in, honey. Shoes by the mat, please." He took off his sneakers and lined them carefully, as if that small act could set the rest of the world straight. Up close, I noticed the shadows under his eyes, the way a worry crease had settled between his brows like a bookmark left too long in a heavy novel. "I brought you something," he said, raising the paper bag. Inside was a loaf of warm bread from the bakery on Maple, the one that still dusts the top with flour like a blessing. "For your soup?" he added, and then looked around, taking in the framed photos on the hall table. Mark in his Little League uniform, Mark and Daniel at the county fair, their faces smeared with powdered sugar from funnel cakes, me in the middle pretending not to mind being sticky and ridiculous. We moved to the kitchen. I offered tea, he asked for water, and the small talk came out in measured scoops: work, traffic, the neighbor's new dog who howled at sirens like a tenor with stage fright. All the while I watched him rest his hands on the edge of the counter, steadying himself the way a person does before saying something that matters. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, and then changed course. "Can I help with anything?" "You can slice the bread," I told him, handing over the serrated knife. He set the loaf on the board and began, each slice careful and even, like he was cutting through something more than crust. When the first piece fell away, steam lifted in a small ribbon, and I realized how quiet it had become, just the knife tapping wood and the soup ticking bubbles against the pot. Finally, he spoke. I didn't know where else to go. The words were plain, but they reached a place in me that had been waiting. The house, so often brave with silence, shifted. I pulled 2 bowls from the cupboard and ladled the soup, setting one in front of him. He didn't pick up the spoon right away. He looked at his reflection in the broth, then at me. "You always listened," he said. "Back then, when we were kids." I told him listening is a habit I never outgrew, and I sat across from him, both of us leaning in without meaning to, like plants finding light. He told me his mother had moved across the country last month. He told me his father's temper, always bad, had found a new edge after the layoff, and home didn't feel like home. He told me he'd been getting by, mostly, but that the quiet at night was the kind that talks back. He said he had tried to call Mark, but they kept missing each other, and he didn't want to leave a message that sounded like a storm cloud. I listened. I asked the small questions. Are you sleeping? Are you eating real food and not just coffee? Have you seen anyone about this? And he answered honestly, which felt like a gift you receive and immediately want to wrap back up in kindness and return. At some point, the radio clicked off on its timer. The kitchen grew softer, lit only by the over-the-sink lamp, which has always made the room feel like a stage where ordinary things become meaningful. A spoon, a napkin, a hand resting near another hand without quite touching it. There was nothing romantic in that kitchen, nothing dramatic either, just the simple ache of one person trying not to fall apart in front of someone who had once tied his spare shoelace during a game because he was too excited to do it himself. When he finally lifted his spoon, he tasted the soup and closed his eyes for a second, like he was letting the warmth take attendance in all the cold places. "This is going to sound strange," he said, setting the spoon down neatly. "But I came to say thank you." "For what?" I asked, honestly confused. "For being the kind of house that always felt safe," he said. "When I was 13 and things got rough, this place was. It smelled like cinnamon and laundry detergent, and there were always clean glasses in the cabinet, and someone asking me if I'd eaten. I didn't realize how much that mattered until I didn't have it anymore. I wanted you to know you made a difference. You still do." There it was, the sentence that slid under my ribs and pressed there, gentle and unignorable. People don't often tell you the good things you did when you were busy trying not to do wrong ones. I felt something rise in my throat, sharp as a laugh and tender as a bruise. I reached for a napkin and pretended to fuss with the breadcrumbs, because tears at my age have a way of smudging the room. "Thank you for saying that," I told him, voice quieter than I meant. "I didn't know it showed." "It showed," he said. "I see it now even more." He asked if he could wash the dishes. I told him that was my domain, but he insisted, and so we stood shoulder to shoulder at the sink, water running, steam fogging the window until the outside world was only a softened suggestion. He washed. I dried. Our rhythm found itself, the way it does when two people accept the same small task at the same time. It's funny how useful it can feel to hand someone a plate and take it back again, both of you making something clean. When we finished, he glanced at the clock and flinched. "I didn't mean to take your whole evening." "You didn't take it," I said. "You gave it some meaning." He smiled, and the worry crease lifted a little, the way a cloud sometimes floats off a hilltop so sunlight can decide what to do with the grass. Before he left, he asked if it would be all right to stop by again. No promises, no schedule, just a place he could come when the quiet got too loud. I told him the truth. My door sticks a bit when it rains, but it opens wide if you lean your shoulder into it and ask nicely. At the entryway, he reached for his shoes, then paused and looked back at the photos on the table. He tapped the frame with his finger, lightly. "We were happy then," he said, "and I forgot for a while that happy could be a place you return to, not just a time you leave." I had to steady myself against the new weight of that sentence. It wasn't heavy in a bad way. It was like a quilt thrown over you on a chilly morning, unexpected, warming, old and new at once. When I opened the door for him, the rain had finally begun, soft and polite, as if asking permission to fall. He stepped onto the porch and turned back. That's when he said the words that have stayed in my heart ever since, the ones that made the evening tilt toward something larger than soup and bread. "You make people feel like they matter," he said. "I hope you know that." Then he pulled the collar of his jacket up, gave me a small nod, and walked down the steps into the silver curtain of rain. I stood watching until his figure blurred, listening to the water thrum on the railings, feeling the house hold the echo of his voice, the way a shell holds the sea. After I closed the door, I leaned my shoulder into it, as if to keep the warmth in. The kitchen smelled of lemon dish soap and steam. The radio light winked in the dimness. I poured myself a cup of tea, I didn't need and sat at the table where the breadcrumbs still marked our place, like punctuation left at the end of a sentence you plan to continue. I thought of Mark, my boy out there with his own storms, and of Daniel's careful slices, his quiet thanks, the way he offered to wash the dishes as if he were mending a small part of the day. I didn't know it yet, not fully, but that gentle visit would become a thread I'd hold when the nights later grew long, and the world asked me to be braver than I felt. It would be the moment I'd return to when I needed proof that steady kindness adds up, that a home can be more than a roof, that someone's simple words can settle into your chest and make a room there, glowing like a porch light you forgot you left on. The next morning the house woke up with the soft industry of a place that had been useful the night before. The dish towel hung crooked on the oven handle. The bread knife still sat near the cutting board like a bookmark left in the middle of a chapter. I made coffee and stood by the window while the backyard wrung itself dry after the rain. The maple leaves glistened as if they'd been polished overnight, and the birds, stubborn optimists, had already returned to their arguments on the fence. I told myself to get on with my day, but my thoughts kept rounding the same corner and finding Daniel there, standing in the doorway with that paper bag, saying what he said in a voice that made the ordinary room feel like a chapel. It's one thing to look back fondly at the past. It's another thing when the past knocks politely, wipes its feet, and asks for a glass of water. I called Mark around noon just to hear his hello. He answered from a parking garage, his voice bouncing off concrete and the whine of a distant engine. We talked about the small things that make up a life. His laundry situation, the office potluck, the neighbor with the loud music upstairs. I told him I'd seen Daniel. There was a pause, not suspicious, just careful. "How did he seem?" Mark asked. "Tired," I said, but honest with it. "That's Daniel," he said. "He'll try to carry the sofa and the bookshelf at the same time, and then apologize for being out of breath." We laughed, and Mark promised to call him. After we hung up, I thought about the quiet spaces people walk through alone. If there is one thing I have learned in my years of making soup and paying bills and shooing dust bunnies from under beds, it's that quiet is not always peace. Sometimes it's just a room waiting for a voice to decide it belongs there. 2 evenings later, the doorbell rang again. I felt a surprising flutter, something like stage fright, something like welcome. When I opened the door, the porch light poured a warm circle around Daniel. He had a library book under his arm and a bunch of grocery store daisies wrapped in crinkly cellophane. "These are for your table," he said, almost shyly. They looked like they needed a job. The daisies went into my tallest jar, which gave them some goofy dignity. He set the library book down on the counter, Steinbeck of all things, and we fell into the familiar choreography of this small kitchen. He washed his hands without being told. I pulled out onions and carrots, the dependable opening act. We didn't name what we were doing, but we both knew. Sometimes cooking is building a shelter you can eat. As we worked, he told me more, how the days were manageable because there were errands and emails, but nights stretched like a road he didn't have gas to finish. He was embarrassed to admit it, which made me want to treat his words with the same care he'd given the bread slices. I told him the truth, that nights have always been the hardest part of the day for me, too, even in a house that knows my steps. After my divorce, there were months when I woke up at 2, am convinced the refrigerator was breathing next to me like a sleeping animal, and I learned to make a truce with the dark by naming what I could see: chair, lamp, curtain, moon stripe on the rug, until the room stopped feeling like a stranger. He nodded, and the nod felt like a handshake between two people agreeing not to pretend any more. We ate simply: pasta with a quick sauce, a salad that squeaked under the fork, daisies supervising from the jar. He told me he'd brought the Steinbeck because he remembered Mark and me arguing playfully about whether we preferred East of Eden or the Grapes of Wrath, and he wanted to show that he had been listening, even back then, even while pretending to be bored teenagers waiting for the cookies to cool. The memory loosened something in my chest. So much of mothering is spent assuming your small rituals vanish into the fog of youth, and here he was, returning with one like a found coin. After dinner, he cleared the plates and asked if he could fix my wobbly chair. He'd noticed it, of course he had, and while I fetched the toolbox from the hall closet, he crouched with the kind of focus people reserve for maps and splinters. He tightened the screws, tested the legs, and then sat in it cautiously, like meeting an acquaintance you hope will become a friend. When it didn't wobble, he grinned. I hadn't realized how much that chair had annoyed me until the annoyance left and relief took its place. It was then he asked, not in a dramatic way, but as if reading from a list he'd written for himself so he wouldn't forget. Would it be all right if we made this a regular thing? I don't want to impose. Maybe once a week for a while. I can bring dinner sometimes, or I can just bring myself and wash dishes. He hesitated, searching for the least complicated words. It helps to have a place where the air doesn't push back. I felt the room take a breath before I did. Yes, I said, but with one condition. His eyebrows lifted. Name it. You stop calling me Mrs. Bennet every other sentence. It makes me feel like the principal who just confiscated your slingshot. He laughed, the sound uncoiling, and tried out my first name. It fit. Names are small doors. It felt right to open that one. And so a rhythm began. Thursdays mostly. He would arrive with something humble, a bag of oranges, a carton of eggs, a bunch of cilantro he was unsure how to use, and we'd make a meal around it. Sometimes we talked the whole time. Sometimes we let the noise of chopping and sizzling do the talking for a while. He told me about the apartment he was saving for, the job that paid the bills but not his spirit, the guitar he hadn't played since his father started sleeping in the living room out of stubbornness and grief. I told him about my garden misadventures, my lost battles with technology, the tiny victories of fixing what I could fix. One evening, when the sky was a thin blue cloth stretched tight over the neighborhood, I suggested a walk after dishes. We took the loop that passes the elementary school and the little park where the swings always seem to be moving even when nobody's on them. He kicked a pebble along like a lazy soccer game. I told him how. When Mark was small and nightmares stood guard by his bed, I taught him to count the porch lights. We would walk and tally them. 1, 2, 3. Each light a little promise that somebody was home and awake, that the night had company. Daniel counted along with me that evening, and at 12 he said, I didn't know you could do that with fear. Turn it into numbers. You can do a lot with fear if you refuse to let it be the only narrator, I said, surprising myself with my sermon. Give it a co-host. Cooking. Counting. Calling somebody. Even washing a stubborn pan until it finally gives up and shines. At the park, a father practiced underhand pitches with his daughter, the softball arsing like a pale moon. We stopped to watch a minute. Daniel's shoulders loosened the way a rope does when you stop pulling at both ends. On our way back, he asked about Mark in the way old friends do when they've let pride cool and memory warm. I told him about the job and the parking garage, and how he still ate cereal at odd hours like the rules of breakfast had personally offended him. There was a quiet after that, not empty, but reverent. Grief and nostalgia are cousins. Sometimes they show up together and sit on your steps without ringing the bell. When we reached my house, he lingered on the porch. The porch light made a wide halo, and moths traced their small, frantic circles. He looked at the jar on the table through the window, the daisies tilting toward one another like they were sharing a secret. "I don't want to take advantage," he said softly. "You aren't," I answered. "You're participating." He took this in and nodded, and in that nod I recognized something steady taking root. We went inside and shared leftover pie, because that's what you do when the evening has been good in a simple way and deserves a closing note. Days later, a small text arrived from an unknown number while I was in line at the hardware store, holding a packet of picture hooks and a paint chip the color of fog. It was Daniel. Thought through the night. The counting helped. Thank you. I felt the message settle in my palm with a seriousness that didn't weigh me down. I typed back that I was glad. I told him I'd found a recipe for lemon bars we could mess up together on Thursday. "Deal," he wrote. Then, after a beat, I told my mom I found a porch light. That line stayed with me through the aisles and the checkout and the walk to the car. It stayed while I hammered the picture hooks into the wall at home and stepped back to make sure the frame sat straight. Some sentences come with their own shelf. You just have to decide where to put them. By the time Thursday rolled around again, the daisies were on their last day. Petals loosened, stems a little weary, but I left them where they were. Not every beautiful thing has to perform at its peak to deserve a place at the table. When the doorbell rang, Daniel stood there with a bag of sugar and a small confidence I hadn't seen before, like he'd been practicing carrying something fragile without crushing it. We sifted flour. We zested lemons until the whole kitchen smelled like a clean beginning. We argued about whether to dust powdered sugar before or after cutting squares. We burned the first batch a shade past caramel. We tried again. We laughed without checking to see if it was allowed. Somewhere between the second attempt and the first bite that wasn't a disaster, he said, almost casually, "I've been thinking I might pick up the guitar again." I set the whisk down and looked at him, not too long, just long enough. "I think that would be good," I said, "for the walls and the windows and the person who lives between them." He smiled and leaned a hip against the counter, and I realized we had begun to build something that didn't need a name to be real. A small, sturdy bridge between the person I had been when the boys were noisy and hungry and the person he was now, noisy on the inside and hungry for quiet that didn't accuse him of being alone. When he left that night, the air was crisp, and the stars looked like someone had poked careful holes in the dark. He turned at the bottom of the steps and lifted a hand in a gesture that felt both old and brand new, and I lifted mine back. I stood in the doorway until the chill reached my elbows, then closed the door and leaned my shoulder into it, not to keep the warmth in this time, but to feel the house agree with me. Something had shifted. Not everything, not the world, not the hard things that still waited, but something small and trustworthy. It was enough to put the kettle on and let the steam sign its name on the window, enough to clear a space on the counter for next Thursday, enough to make room in my chest for a guitar that hadn't been played in years, and the soft, certain promise of porch lights counted and counted again. The following week, life carried on with its errands and bills, but the quiet of my evenings felt different, less like an empty room and more like a chair waiting to be filled. I had begun to notice how the air held a certain calm after Daniel left, as if conversation itself could sweep the corners clean. He came again, this time not with groceries or bread, but with a small notebook tucked under his arm. "I started writing things down," he said, almost embarrassed. "Not big stuff, just thoughts that won't let me sleep unless I put them somewhere." He placed it on the table like it might break. I poured tea, and he read me a few lines. They weren't polished, but they were honest. Fragments about walking past lit windows, about missing laughter, about not wanting to be invisible. Each sentence felt like it belonged to someone learning how to breathe differently. I told him words have weight, and writing them down gives your heart a chance to rest. He looked at me with a kind of relief that said he believed me. That evening was simpler than the others. No long stories, no heavy confessions, just two people sipping tea while rain pattered gently on the roof. Before he left, he said, "It feels lighter when I leave here. Like the night isn't so sharp." I stood in the doorway after he'd gone, holding that sentence in my chest. It wasn't grand or dramatic, but it stayed, humming softly, reminding me that sometimes the most unexpected gifts are not what people bring in their hands, but what they leave behind in your heart. It was late autumn when the rhythm of our Thursdays found its most natural pace. The air outside carried the first bite of winter, and the maple leaves that had once glistened with rain now lay curled and brittle along the curb. Inside, the kitchen had grown familiar again, not just as my space, but as ours, a small place where two different lives had agreed to overlap once in a while. On one of those colder evenings, Daniel arrived with his guitar case. He set it down by the door almost sheepishly, as if carrying both a burden and a possibility. "I thought maybe." He began, then stopped, glancing at me for permission he didn't need. I told him to bring it in, that the house hadn't heard music in too long. He tuned the strings slowly, carefully, his fingers deliberate as though reacquainting themselves with an old language. When he finally strummed, the sound was rough but true, filling the room with something I hadn't realized I'd missed. It wasn't about the song itself. It was about watching him remember, watching him allow himself to make noise without apology. I sat quietly, letting the notes stitch themselves into the wallpaper of memory. When he finished, he looked almost startled, as though he hadn't expected the sound to come out at all. "It feels like breathing," he admitted softly. "I forgot I could do that." We talked then, not about fears or worries, but about small futures, how he might join a local group, how I might finally paint the living room the color of fog I'd been carrying around on a paint chip. It wasn't grand dreaming, just the kind that lets you lean forward instead of backward. Before he left that night, he lingered at the door, guitar in hand. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "You've given me something I didn't think I'd find again." "You gave it to yourself." I told him. All I did was keep the light on. He nodded, and his smile reached past the worry lines for the first time. Then he stepped into the chilled night air, the porch light stretching his shadow down the walkway. I watched until he turned the corner, the guitar case balanced easily now, as if it had always belonged on his shoulder. Later, sitting at the table alone, I looked at the empty jar where the daisies had once stood. Their stems had long since been cleared away, but the memory of their bright insistence remained, and I realized that what he had left me was more lasting than flowers or music. It was a reminder that kindness never disappears, it only waits for someone to notice its glow. That evening closed a circle I hadn't known was open. I carried his words with me, not as a burden, but as proof. A home can still be a safe place, even when the children have gone. A simple meal can still be a refuge, and one honest voice at the door can change the shape of your heart for years to come.